Aviation museums are awesome. I have had the privilege to visit many different aviation museums across the US. From Arizona to Georgia, Washington, D.C., and Alaska, but I've never visited one in a foreign country. Well, until now. First thing, let's go back in time. I've just arrived into Sao Paulo, off a long-haul flight from Atlanta. I made a video about it on my channel. I then made a 1-hour drive north to São Jose dos Campos, and the subject of today's video. When I arrived, I was met with the Embraer campus, which is right outside the museum, and it was so cool to see this up close. Embraer is the third largest aviation manufacturer in the world, and they have a sizable operation here. I even saw a brand new Embraer E195-E2 jet that would be bound for Porter Airlines in Canada. And a few weeks later, I was lucky enough to spot her in action, landing in Toronto. Pretty cool. Should I fly Porter? I'd like to. Comment below if so. Anyways, back to Brazil and the present. Embraer, having some setbacks in recent years, still continues to build their flagship E2 jet, and things are generally good. I even saw the smallest E2 variant, the E175-E2, which is yet to be certified by regulators. But now, let's check out the museum. This is the world's most secretive aviation museum. Welcome to the Embraer MAB Aviation Museum. The first area of the museum is an outdoor exhibition showing lots of different Embraer aircraft over the years, starting with the EMB-110 Bandeirante, their first and smallest aircraft. There are also some various military aircraft on display, like this AMX A1, donated to the museum by the Brazil Air Force. Also, I couldn't have asked for nicer weather. There were blue skies and a light breeze. This helped counteract the nearly 100-degree heat. Also, I love the flag. Brazil has such a great flag, and it made for a great shot with this Embraer logo. Did you know that the Embraer logo has that distinctive shape for many of their aircraft having a T-tail design, starting with the Embraer 120. Speaking of that, here is the Embraer EMB-120 Brasileira. Despite the success of the Embraer 110, it wasn't selling very well, and in 1985, Embraer rolled out the EMB-120. It took to the skies, and then the company really began to take off, pardon the pun. The Embraer 120 entered service in October with Atlantic Southeast Airlines, who would operate the aircraft on behalf of Delta Connections. This proved that the aircraft is not only safe and reliable, that Embraer as a whole was a trustworthy company. Moving right along, we have the CBA-123 Vector. This was an interesting aircraft. Only 3 were ever built, as a prototype for design was never really wanted. This design became a mess after the Brazilian government merged many small aircraft manufacturers into a national company to be known as Embraer. However, the design would be somewhat adopted with some major changes to become the ERJ, or Embraer Regional Jet Series, which would prove to be quite popular, especially with US regional airlines. In fact, as of 2024, the ERJ is still widely used. Moving on, there are also several rockets and other military aircraft on display, including the EMB-314 and an American-built A6 Intruder. Pretty soon, I decided it was time to head inside though, as it was really hot today, more than 100 degrees. On our way inside, we passed this painting of Alberto Santos Dumont. Also, it was so quiet inside this museum today. as myself, my aunt, and our friend Daniel were the only ones at the museum today. Once inside, we were met with a landing gear strut off an Embraer 120. And many different examples of bombs, as this area was devoted to the Brazilian Air Force. There was even a fascinating bomb with little bombs inside of it. Bombs, especially foreign-built bombs, are one aspect of aviation that I don't know much about, and I found this fascinating. Moving on from the bombs, we were met with this massive wall called the Embraer History Wall, according to the museum. This was fascinating, and I am always a fan of aviation history, especially aviation history. But you already know that if you've watched my channel for a while. Right next to the history wall, there were several exhibits all about rockets and Brazil's space efforts, which still continue to today. There were also several model aircraft on display, all about Embraer's history to go with the wall. There was also an exhibit on alternative fuels, and even some parts off different rockets. This was very cool. Back in the US, many rockets and space projects are very secretive, and many actual rockets and rocket parts are destroyed for security purposes, but not in Brazil apparently. Who knew? Also, Brazil's space efforts continue, even to today. They still have some ambitious plans. They would like to land on the moon. They would also like to be the first to put a man on Mars. I think these plans aren't super easy to do for sure, but if anyone can accomplish them, it's Brazil. I was most amazed simply with the vast amount of rocket exhibits that were here, especially parts off of actual rockets. Even though it's not well known, during the 1950s and 60s, Brazil really tried their efforts to be the first to put a man on the moon. They made several prototype aircraft, and most of these rockets, while successful in design, were not successful in flight testing. A lot of people died, unfortunately, and Brazil still never put a person on the moon. However, these efforts still continue to today. There are even some pieces of carbon fiber models off of actual rockets. Carbon fiber, by the way, is a very lightweight modern material used on spacecraft and some new airliners. Following these failures, Brazil tried their hand at some satellites. These were much more successful. There are also several astronauts who've been on the International Space Station from Brazil, among many other countries. So even though they haven't reached a planet that they were the first to, they have at least put people into space, and done so safely. Like I mentioned, they had several exhibits off of satellites here too, parts, prototypes, and models. But my favorite models, of course, were the aircraft models, like this Learjet 75 and this Embraer 170. By the way, the new Embraer E2 program killed off this smallest variant. I don't know why. If you know, leave a comment below. There are also several military installations in this hangar, like I mentioned, and these were fascinating as well. There's no doubt that military aviation has played a large part in the development of aviation as a whole in Brazil. There is also this model of this ERJ-145, the R99, a modified variant delivered to the military. There is also a model of this General Dynamics F-16. I have no idea why this was here. Does anybody know? I don't think they fly F-16s in Brazil. If you know, leave a comment. I really enjoyed these model aircraft, especially the business jets, like this Bombardier Global. And of course, there were more exhibits on Brazil's endeavors in space, which really were quite expansive. I didn't know Brazil put so much effort into space. There were probably at least a dozen model rockets here, and they were quite large, probably 20 feet tall. I'm not sure if these were all prototypes, or if these were not prototypes and were just built to be models for the museum, as I don't read Portuguese. I do, however, know that's the symbol of the German DLR, the company who worked with NASA to help develop SOFIA, the 747SP flying telescope, which has now been retired and sent to the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona. There were also several cars on display in the museum, notable because of how they were powered. This car was the first one to be powered by alcohol-based fuels, a type of sustainable fuel which has been implemented in cars and tested. There was also a modified Embraer 110, built and modified for the Brazilian Air Force to be a troop transport aircraft. This was pretty cool. You used to be able to go on board this aircraft, but this wasn't the case, at least when I visited. I really do like the paint scheme on this aircraft though. I like the blue cheat line, it's very classy. And of course, they've retained this color on their transport aircraft even to today. The Embraer 110 also has to have a tail stand, as it's known. That's what this yellow bar is for, to keep the aircraft from tipping back and getting a tail strike while parked on the ground. These are put in place to help the aircraft be more balanced when loading and unloading. There were also several military medals of honor displayed over here, as well as some different turboprop engines used over the years. These were really cool to see in person, again since they were real engines and not just models built for museum use. This engine was a Pratt & Whitney PT6, the same type of turboprop used on many different turboprop airliners today, including the Dash 8 and, you guessed it, the Embraer 110. You can tell a turboprop engine based on the cut-off exhaust stack there, and that downward shape of the engine that blends right into the wing. That's a pretty common way to tell. Also, I mentioned the interior of this aircraft was closed. However, I was able to source these photos from the internet. The inside looks pretty vintage, but it would have still been cool to go on board. This aircraft not only transported troops, but also VIPs, hence the nicer seats. And this vintage cockpit was pretty cool as well. Of course, I had to get a picture next to it for the thumbnail, which I never ended up using for this video, unfortunately. To wrap up this video, we'll talk about the final exhibit on display. There were several exhibits on display by Santos Dumont, Brazil's most famous aviator. Alberto Santos Dumont is Brazil's equivalent to the Wright brothers in the US. And although I know controversy gets clicks and I try to avoid it, there is a little bit of controversy about flying machines and who was truly first. This aircraft you're seeing here is called the 14 Bis and was the design by Santos Dumont to be the first flying machine. This is not the original, of course, but is a model. Santos Dumont was in the race to try to be the first to make a flying machine, and his flying machine looks remarkably similar to the Wright brothers, simply due to the designs available at the day with wood and canvas. Dumont conducted several test flights with his aircraft, and people of Brazil say he was first. However, firm records were not kept until a few years later. The Wrights first flew on December 17th of 1903, and their plane required a track and rail system. Many people argue, including the people of Brazil, that this didn't count. Santos Dumont's aircraft, while the first flights were not well documented until after the Wright brothers, did not require a track and used wheels like a modern plane. But what do you think? Who was really first, Dumont or the Wright brothers? The world will never truly know. Well, that's going to do it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. I'd really appreciate to hear your thoughts and see if you liked this video. Anyways, you know the drill. That's all I have for you this time. And until next time, I'll be wishing you blue skies and tailwinds.